Welcome to this final session of the weekend FT Spring Festival, in which I'm delighted to be joined by Fareed Zakaria, who needs no introduction to most of you. He's a host of Fareed Zakaria GPS, probably the most watched foreign policy show in the world on CNN. Became editor of Foreign Affairs aged 28, so there's really no hope left for the rest of us. Is author of several very well acclaimed books, The Post-American World, and most recently, 10 Lessons for a Post-Pandemic World, which we'll get into. But first of all, Fareed, let's just get straight into the Biden administration. Now, Joe Biden very frequently repeats the phrase, America is back. But I'm tempted to quote the sort of ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus, who said, you can't step into the same river twice. This is a very different world to the one in 2016 that Biden left as vice president. And I guess the most important question is, when he says America is back, what does that mean? Is there a strategy to back that up?
Well, thanks for having me, Ed, and thank you to the FT. It's a great honor. I'm a big fan of the FT. So the way I would put it, I think what is in Biden's mind more than anything else is the idea of kind of rebuilding America's power and engagement. You know, there was a great columnist, William Pfaff, who at the end of the Cold War wrote that surveying the landscape of the Cold War, he came to one conclusion: being was more important than doing. Being was more important than doing, by which he meant all those places that the United States chased the Soviet Union, from Angola to Nicaragua to Cambodia, it all turned out to be, largely irrelevant, a waste of resources, tragic. What mattered was that fundamentally the United States had a very strong, powerful, dynamic economy, a vibrant political system, and that overwhelmed and outlasted the Soviet Union. So I think, in a sense, Biden's principal agenda is the rebuilding of American power. And you see that in the extraordinary effort they've made to get the vaccine right and to get the vaccine rollout right, to tackle COVID, then to do a massive COVID relief plan, and on to the next one, which is going to be a really massive infrastructure plan. If he is able to get all of that done, Goldman Sachs is estimating that the US economy will grow by 7.7% by the end of this year. That would be the highest growth rate the United States has had in 40 years. It would mean that for the first time since 2005, the United States will contribute more to global growth than China. So if all that comes together, then you have an America, I think, that not just comes across as the most dynamic economy in the world, but also, crucially, a competent American state that is able to do things at grand scale, vaccinate people. We're vaccinating right now at 3 million people a day. One day last week, we vaccinated, I say we, the United States government vaccinated 4.5 million people. That is more than the total number of people who have been vaccinated in Italy from start to finish. So that, to my mind, is the core element of it. The second element is the engagement with the world. And there you are entirely right. My pronunciation, probably incorrectly, is Heraclitus, but your metaphor, right, or the line is absolutely right. You can't step in the same river twice, and the world has changed an awful lot.
In what way does a first term for Joe Biden, with all the things he wants to do in terms of rebuilding America's position, standing, alliances, integrity even, in what way does it differ from a third Obama term on the foreign policy front?
I think the most important way in which it's different is that the Democratic Party has learned the lesson of the Obama years. And the lesson of the Obama years, I think, fundamentally was don't trim your sails. What the public will respond to and will reward you for is if you try to enact your agenda full-blooded, wholehearted, full-throated, and it will either work or it won't. but trimming your sails, being overly deferential, trying to split the difference. What ends up happening is the other side, particularly today's Republican Party, does not compromise. It actually undercuts you. And at the end of the day, you get so little done that the public doesn't see government as working. And that the most important thing for those who believe in government, for progressives, is government has to work. So you have to show that you can get stuff done. I think it's fair to say that if Biden gets the things I just described done, this will be the most progressive and expansionist view of government since the Great Society. And really since basically 64, 65, 66. Because after that, Vietnam overwhelmed Johnson and he didn't get much done. And so you are looking at something that is really quite historic. I mean, this would be a transformational presidency led by the most untransformational character you could imagine, right? An old Pole, Joe Biden, who's been around forever, navigated the center of the Democratic Party, no matter where it was. But the lesson, I think, from the Obama years was go for it. Not on foreign policy, but, by the way, which is interesting. On foreign policy, he is still being very careful and cautious and navigating between what I suspect his instincts are to rejoin the Iran deal, to try to find some workable areas of cooperation with China, even with Russia, to re-engage with some of the international agencies and things like that, and being well aware that there is a nationalist, populist critique of all that, articulated most powerfully by Donald Trump, but also by a whole bunch of senators and lots of people on Fox News and talk radio. And so they're being more cautious.
Well, we're talking just the day after the first official meeting between the Biden administration and the Chinese government, which took place in Anchorage. And Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, and Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, went to Anchorage, met their Chinese counterparts, and it ended without an official communique because they just didn't get along. They lectured each other on human rights. The Chinese took great affront to having Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and other things mentioned. Now, both Sullivan and Blinken have said, look, we've got to walk and chew gum with China. We can't just confront. We have to cooperate at the same time. Right now, though, it seems like it's going to be confrontational. Can they de-link things? I mean, can John Kerry, talk to China about global warming and keep that completely separate to Blinken lecturing them on human rights? Can we have an un-Kissinger here, a sort of de-linkage that works in any way for the United States?
It's a great question. I think no one knows the answer, but I think that scene in Anchorage, was really quite remarkable. And in a sense, it's a window into the world we are moving into. So the United States set up the meeting. It was on US territory. It was meant to be, an attempt to try to figure out where do we agree, where do we disagree. I was somewhat puzzled by the decision to allow opening statements, particularly given that the opening statements from the United States were pretty tough, as you say. They talked about Hong Kong and Xinjiang and Taiwan and other things. And here's what I think is new. We are entering something of a bipolar world, a world with two powers that loom above all the rest. The United States is still by far the most powerful country in the world. But when I wrote my book and I did the numbers, I was surprised by how much China had caught up. So China is not just the second largest economy in the world. It's larger than the next four economies put together. China, again, is the second largest military spender in the world, but again, more than the next four military budgets put together. Russia, Britain, France. So we're in a world where these two are in a league of their own. And the Chinese were not going to be lectured by the United States without responding. And I think perhaps that was a surprise to the United States, but it would suggest that the format was odd. I mean, if you were looking for a way to engage with the Chinese, might have been better to just have private talks, have everyone say hello to the cameras. But if you set it up with a public commentary and the United States thinks it's going to be able to denounce China, and the Chinese will not in turn denounce the United States, well, we're in a different world. The Chinese feel no need to be subservient to the United States or subordinate to them. And this may be the shape of things to come, that there is going to have to be a modus vivendi between these two countries. The United States is number one, but the gap is not as great as it seems to think that it is.
I promise that this will be the last time I quote an ancient Greek figure, but of course, the famous Thucydides trap says that the war usually happens between an existing hegemon and a rising one, Athens and Sparta. And we're waiting for the Biden administration to produce a China strategy. Is there such a thing as a workable China strategy in the circumstances you've just set out?
I think so. Look, we are living in this new bipolar age or emerging bipolar age. There's no question, the Thucydides argument, which of course, Thucydides was a historian noting one particular power transition. It has been then theorized into a kind of grand theory of international relations, in which every time a rising power comes, it causes trouble, which is, there's a fair degree of truth to it, but we're living in a very different world, Ed, as you know. We're living, to give you one example, that during the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union traded in their best year, $5 billion worth of goods and services that year. The United States and China trade $5 billion worth of goods and services every day. The two economies are tightly interlinked, as are the economies of China and the rest of the world. So I don't think you can really have the kind of great power conflict that people are imagining when they look back historically. China also is not looking, as far as I can tell, to conquer the world. China has a very different conception of its great power. It clearly wants power and influence. If you think about it, there is a big difference between Britain and the United States, the two great superpowers, 19th century, 20th century, which is they both were proselytizing superpowers. They both believed that it was part of their historical destiny to bring the rest of the world into a kind of modernity that they conceived and described. Think of Britain with the British Empire. When America goes into Iraq, the goal at some level is to make Iraq more like America, to make it a modern, democratic. China has no such conception. China doesn't think anyone else can be Chinese. They have an ethno-nationalist conception of great power. They want to make China great. So I think that there is room for a world in which the United States and China can coexist. But there will have to be, parameters, and there will have to be accommodations on both sides. And the fundamental one is probably this. The United States has to find a way to articulate a goal that is not the conversion of China to Westerndom or to the successor to Christendom, if you will. If the idea is that China is ultimately going to be pressured, cajoled, harangued into becoming a Western liberal democracy, I think we're in for a very tough struggle. If there is more of a sense of live and let live, I think there is a path forward.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, and the word proselytizing, clearly that's very close to how America is often conducted its kind of default position on foreign policy. And Biden, in some respects, is no exception, because he has expressed this desire to have a D10 of democracies. And he's couched the struggle between China and the United States, but also Russia, China, and the United States as one of autocracy versus democracy. But in his initial dealings with the Europeans, first of all at the Munich summit, but also in more recent exchanges, it doesn't look like the Europeans, including the Germans, or at least the members of the EU, I know Britain is distinct, see the world that way. Germany exports, something like 4 times as many Volkswagens to China as it does to America, and it seems to be viewing things through that prism. Do you think that Biden's democracy versus autocracy thing is going to catch on, or is he going to quietly drop it?
I think that there's no question there is something to it, that there is a world in which the legitimacy of governments is largely derived from the consent of the governed, and those countries do behave in a more civilized way, particularly towards their own citizens. I don't want to sound in any sense to be oblivious to that very important distinction. And I do think that China and Russia and some other countries like that have tended to create a kind of axis in which they, for example, undermine things like the Human Rights Commission of the United Nations. They try to downplay the ability of other countries to interfere in the internal affairs of the nations. But a lot of what the US says it wants to do, which is to rebuild and shore up and strengthen the rules-based international order, a lot of that the Chinese are happy to agree with. Even the Russians. I mean, they're in some ways the rule-based order assumes state sovereignty, assumes that the key is that states have to play by the rules internationally, but within their borders they are sovereign. So they've often not had that much difficulty with a rules-based order. So I think that that's one of the big differences between Europe and the United States. When Europe thinks of a rules-based order, they think about the things I was just talking about. Are you following trade rules? Are you following UN conventions? Are you following international norms? When the US thinks about it, they also add to it very crucially things like the internal treatment of your citizens. So Tibet, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, something like Taiwan, which is a kind of murky gray area in terms of what it counts as. But I think that, let me put it this way: the distinction you draw is very real between the way Europe and the United States view it. And by the way, I think it'll get more murky if Merkel, when Merkel passes from the scene. I think people forget Germany has always tried to play this middle role in sort of bridging between East and West, between the Americans and the rest of the world. Merkel, because she came from East Germany, was more moralistic in her foreign policy than any German statesman I can think of, going back to Adenauer. And so when you get another West German chancellor, I think you are going to return to the Willy Brandt type attitude of, German, we are Germany, we are the center of the continent, and we have to find a way to accommodate everyone. So I do think that the Europeans are more likely to want to shore up that conception of the liberal international order, not the conception of the liberal international order that says, as I say, ultimately the only solution is that China become a liberal democracy.
Now, you've been in America, I know, for 40 years or so, but you were born and raised in what was then called Bombay. And India is, of course, a much bigger power than it was when you left. It's also still just about able to claim it's the world's largest democracy, though I would argue the world's largest illiberal democracy under Narendra Modi. Any D10, if you're going to have the world's democracies, would have to include India. But if it isn't to be meaningless, the United States and other members of the D10 would have to criticize it for turning non-Hindu citizens gradually into second-class citizens. Yet India is critical as a counterbalance to China. How does Biden thread his needle through that one?
So far, the Biden administration has seemed to essentially ignore the decay of democracy in India. I think it'd be very hard to find much discussion of it. Let me give you one example. There is an enormous amount of attention on how the Chinese government is treating Muslims in Xinjiang, the Uyghurs. Correctly so, properly so. What the Chinese are doing is appalling. It's probably a crime against humanity. There's very little attention to how the Indian government is treating Muslims in Kashmir, which is also appalling. If you look at what has happened to Kashmir, and in some ways this goes back to before Modi, but over the last 40 years, Kashmir has essentially been ruled by martial law. The rule of law does not apply. Democracy does not apply. The habeas corpus does not apply. So, and that's just one example. I think that the tragedy of what is going on in India, and it is a tragedy, is that Hinduism by nature is a very pluralistic, open, accommodating religion. It may be the most accommodating religion in the world. I mean, to be a Hindu, you can believe in one God, you can believe in 300, you can believe it is absolutely necessary to be a vegetarian, not to kill God's creatures. You can absolutely believe that it's entirely all right to eat meat. You can, it is so synchronistic and open that, and at its core, there is such a sense of tolerance and nonviolence that it's a tragedy that Hindu nationalism, which is really a kind of imported European weaponized conception of Hinduism, has begun to dominate the country. And you're absolutely right. Muslims in India have already become second-class citizens. And I think it's fair to say it's not just Muslims. It is happening to the small number of Christians as well. It's happening to other religions. And it's also what you're seeing is India behaving in ways that are typical of autocracies, expelling foreign journalists, expelling foreign or harassing in some way or the other NGOs. India, the great pride of India, even in the 1960s and 70s, even when it was very poor, was that it was very open. It had a vibrant free press. The Rockefeller and Ford Foundation were welcomed and honored. And now, what you see is a country that behaves more like Putin's Russia or Erdogan's Turkey, with the kind of deep suspicion of independent media, deep suspicion of NGOs. People are locked up, jailed, questioned, intimidated. So these are some of the softer elements that have gone as well. And to your point, Ed, the Democratic 10 or whatever you call them, it's only going to have meaning if it has deep moral legitimacy, because ultimately these countries don't all share strategic interests in common. Many of them have very different attitudes towards geopolitical issues, but they could have a shared conception about democracy. And the great threat to democracy right now, as you say, is illiberal democracy. We're not seeing a lot of coups. We're not seeing a lot of, what we're mostly seeing is the degradation of democracy from within. What is happening in Hungary, what is happening in Turkey, what happened in Russia. People forget now, but the 2000 in Russia was actually a democracy. So it's that which has to be criticized, which has to be judged, which has to be shored up against. And what do you do when India is one of the key perpetrators of the problem rather than the solution to it?
No, it's a very good question, and I'm sure we'll return to it another time. Let me ask you a couple more before sampling two or three of the very good questions that have been coming from the audience. Jake Sullivan, Biden's strategic thinker, really, national security advisor, talks about a foreign policy for the middle class. Now, in your book, 10 Lessons for the Post-Pandemic World, you say the pandemic hasn't so much shifted the paradigm as accelerated existing trends. And one of them, of course, you were talking about earlier, which is more middle-class economics, bigger government, great society kind of feel on the domestic front. But what does it mean for foreign policy to have a foreign policy for the middle class? I mean, if you were feeling skeptical, you'd say, that's just a posh phrase for we're not going to do any trade deals. What's your interpretation of it?
I think it's an entirely it's a slogan born of the Trump experience, born of the rise of populism, and the sense that global elites and globalization are vulnerable to the criticism that they left the American working class behind. We don't say working class in America, so everyone is middle class. So you talk about the American middle class being left behind. Look, I think it's fundamentally misleading, because it suggests that globalization has been terrible for the American middle class, which is entirely untrue. Globalization has been fantastic for most of the American middle class. They have gotten huge tax cuts as a result. They've gotten cheaper goods, cheaper food, cheaper clothes, which for poor people and for lower middle class people comprise a huge share of their annual budget. So this is actually very critical, and it has allowed for a standard of living that is really extraordinary. Now, there are some problems. I don't deny it all. The whole problem with free trade that Ricardo talked about at the start was the benefits are spread throughout the society in a slightly shallow way, but the costs are concentrated. You see that steel mill that goes out of business. You see that auto manufacturing plant that goes out of business, and the town therefore gets destroyed. You describe this vividly in your last book, and that's very real, and that's the politics of what we're talking about. But look at the vaccine, Ed. Everything that we rail about globalization is the reason why this vaccine has been possible. The vaccine is a triumph of globalization, global science and scientific cooperation. The virus was sequenced in China, the work began in Germany. The funding then came from the United States, the European Union. The production is entirely a product of global supply chains. 60% of it is being made in India. The glass bottles are all made in China. The reason we will be able to produce 4 billion vaccines in the next 2 years is entirely because of globalization. So to my mind, it's a good example of how we pocket all the gains that come from globalization. But we focus entirely on the costs. They're very similar with what happens to the European Union. You go to Greece and you marvel at the roads they have, and nobody says, "Yo, yes, this is all because of the European Union." The European Union accounted for 6% of Greece's GDP for 25 years. But, one bank goes under, one loan is called in, and like the perfidious European Union is this is all because of them. So, we have to find a way, if we are going to continue to live in a world of deep global engagement, cooperation, and trade, which is inevitable, we have to find a way to not keep blaming these forces, because it becomes very quickly a blaming of foreigners. That's what Trump found. Easiest, rather than talk about globalization, why don't we talk about the Chinese, the Mexicans, and the Muslims? Those are the bad people. And you're seeing, I do think it is connected, violence against Asian Americans. If you live in an atmosphere where everything happening outside is bad, and you have succumbed to these perfidious foreigners, it's not a huge step to then weaponize it against them.
I've got plenty more questions, but I don't want to be too selfish, because unsurprisingly, the FT audience has sent quite a lot of very good questions. Let me ask you 2 or 3 of them. How damaged is America's soft power?
Not very. I tend to believe that that this is exaggerated. That, look, we had terrible times during Vietnam. We were able to recover from it. We had terrible times during the Iraq War. We were able to recover from it. I think particularly in the democratic world, people understand, America is a democracy. You get bad governments. You get governments that make bad policies. That is not fundamentally about America. What I worry more about is 2 things. One, that countries around the world have seen the Trump phenomenon, which was such a diversion from the American norm, and they will think this could happen again. So that piece of it, that hedging, that insurance policy that countries might say, we just can't rely on America, not because of anything they're doing wrong now, but because we could get another Trump. That's worrying. And the other one is, I worry less about the soft power. I do worry about the hard power. I do believe being is more important than doing. And so as long as America can, in fact, have the best industries in the world, dominate the technologies of the future, have the greatest infrastructure, it's going to be fine. That is not entirely guaranteed. And China is a very spirited competitor in that regard. I'm still pretty, I'm confident. I'm not what Sam Huntington called a declinist, somebody who believes American decline is inevitable. But I think this is the first peer competitor the United States has had in a long, long time.
Did Huntington pronounce it declinist?
He said he wanted to call it declinist because he thought he coined the term, and he said, I didn't want to call them decliners because that might suggest that they, rather than the subjects of their study, are declining.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Okay, here's another question. Can you comment on what the focal point is of a geopolitical axis between India, the European Union, and the United States? Now, I might narrow that down to drop India, because you've dealt with some of the sort of double-edged swords there. What is it that would bring the Europeans? What's a transatlantic strategy look like under Biden?
one word about India, which is the only one that could be China. And that it does, and it's complicated because Europe has a very different attitude towards China. But India is also not very active on the world stage. If you look at India's foreign ministry budget, it's 1/4 in per capita terms what China's is. If you look at the number of foreign ministry officials, ambassadors, consuls, it's 1/4 what China's is per capita. So they're not there. India is a country, as you well know, Ed, you were there for many years. It's internally obsessed. If you could read 10 Indian newspapers in the morning and barely know the outside world exists. The transatlantic relationship, I think, is going to, properly focused, it would be about this idea of shoring up the liberal international order, of trying to create a structure within which, the next group of great powers can rise. The challenges of the world can be managed. The danger is, while we talk about that, the United States, for its part, violates the liberal international order quite often. I mean, I don't think Iraq was a shining example of fulfilling the international rules-based system. If you look at the tariffs that the United States under Trump placed on Europe, they are entirely a violation of the spirit of the international order. Trump claimed that Germany and China posed a national security threat to the United States. That was the emergency use, or the exception, which allowed him to place those tariffs on. So even the China tariffs are, somewhat suspect in that sense. So one of the challenges is going to be, if you're going to build a rules-based order or shore it up, you have to adhere to it. I mean, the United States is not a signatory to the International Criminal Court. The United States, to this day, routinely and repeatedly criticizes China for violating the law of the sea treaty when it builds that set of islands in the South China Sea, when it sends its boats into the East China Sea. But the United States is itself not a signatory to the law of the sea treaty, which is, to my mind, a perfect example of this problem. The United States tends to believe that the liberal international order applies to everyone else, but it, as the gatekeeper, as the guardian, as the kind of Zeus-like figure, exists outside of it. And I don't think that can continue anymore.
Okay, let me merge a couple of questions, which, depending on the length of your answer, might have to be the final one. Fareed, do you think the American public is aware of how much more competent the Biden team is than Trump's? And I would add to that, do you think Biden in his own head is acting like he's a one-term president? Obviously, he wouldn't be able to declare that, because that would make him impotent. But do you think in his own mind he's working on that assumption?
My own sense is that politicians never think that they are, they're one-term people. I don't know, and I think it's, I understand the actuarial tables, and Joe Biden is 78 years old, but I find that whether it's, maybe it's powerful people in general, powerful men in particular, I don't get the sense that Rupert Murdoch is approaching life with the thought that he's going to, die anytime soon, though he's 90. And I suspect that Joe Biden doesn't think that. By the way, that's why I happen to think that Trump will run again for the presidency. He will, in 24, he will be as old as Biden was in 2020. And to the broader question, the answer is no. I don't think that the public realizes how much more competent Biden is, because we are living in an age of polarization in which your political identity is largely determined by a kind of tribal affiliation that is rooted in class, culture, ethnicity, perhaps a little bit race. And what that means is, and this is very distressing, politics has been delinked from performance. You support Donald Trump because you believe, it's almost like supporting a sports team. And a true fan of a sports team, a football team in Britain, you do it whether they win or they lose. And when they lose, it's a greater act of loyalty, of tribalism, to continue to support. It's an act of betrayal to leave them when they're down. That's where we seem to be in politics, which is unfortunate because it means it's kind of delinked from performance.
You timed that to perfection. There are 7 seconds left, which is enough time for me to say that was a great tour d'horizon. Thank you very much, Fareed, and we must do it again.
Always a pleasure, Ed. Thank you for asking.
Thank you very much.
Wow, what an epic 3 days. Ed, Fareed, inspirational finale. Thank you so much. This was our first Spring Festival and it certainly will not be our last. Our theme was renewal and we really hope we've renewed your appetite for big ideas and things to look forward to.
Now, before the curtain falls on the spring edition of the FT Weekend Festival, a reminder that this is